2,000 years ago, a small republic on the Italian peninsula began a journey that would change the world forever. From the rise of a brilliant general to the glory of an empire that ruled 3 continents, from the secret lives of powerful emperors to a city buried under volcanic ash, and finally to the dramatic fall of Rome itself. 5 stories, 5 epic journeys through power, ambition, tragedy, and legacy. This is the story of the Roman Empire. Tonight, you will witness history come alive. On a cold winter night in 49 BC, a Roman general stood beside a narrow river in northern Italy. Behind him waited a loyal army. Ahead of him stood the laws of Rome. No Roman commander was allowed to cross this river with soldiers. But the man standing there was not like other commanders. His name was Julius Caesar, and the decision he was about to make would change the fate of the Roman Republic forever. Tonight, in the Midnight Empire series, we step back into the final centuries of the Roman Republic, a world of ambition, political intrigue, and powerful families fighting for control of Rome. Among them rose one man whose name would echo across history. Julius Caesar was not born an emperor. He began as a young nobleman in a dangerous and unpredictable city. Yet, through war, strategy, and bold decisions, he would rise higher than any Roman before him. This is the story of how Julius Caesar climbed from a struggling aristocrat to the most powerful man in Rome. Chapter 1. A dangerous beginning.
Indeed, we must
On a
discuss the
cold
tides.
winter morning
Friends,
in
what news
100
from the scrolls?
BC,
The omens are favorable
Rome
for
was
trade.
anything but
Let us
quiet.
proceed.
The streets were alive with whispers of power struggles, political rivalries, and the constant murmur of those trying to survive in a city ruled by the bold and the ruthless. In this world of endless ambition, one young boy was born, Julius Caesar. He belonged to the Julii family, an ancient line of Roman nobility, but his family had fallen on hard times. Though the name carried weight, their fortunes had dwindled, leaving young Caesar with status but little influence. From an early age, Caesar witnessed the dangers that came with ambition. The Roman Republic was no safe haven. Political violence was a daily threat, and power often came at the cost of blood. It was a world where alliances shifted like sand, and yesterday's friend could be tomorrow's enemy. Even his family was not immune. When Caesar was just a teenager, the ruthless dictator Sulla viewed him with suspicion. Sulla demanded loyalty, and in Caesar's case, he demanded submission. But the young man's spirit would not bend so easily. To escape the dictator's wrath, Caesar fled Rome, leaving behind the familiar streets of his youth. Imagine a teenager forced to leave home, walking the roads of Italy under the shadow of political assassins. Fear must have weighed on him, but even more powerful was determination. He had glimpsed the harsh realities of Rome, and he knew that survival would require cunning, courage, and perhaps a touch of audacity. During his exile, Caesar observed, learned, and planned. He was young, but not naive. He saw how Roman families rose and fell, how senators schemed, and how soldiers could sway the course of history. Every encounter, every whispered warning, and every hidden threat added to his understanding of the dangerous game he was about to play. These early lessons would shape him, forge him into a man capable of remarkable ambition, and teach him the fine line between daring and disaster. And yet, Caesar was not driven solely by fear or survival. There was curiosity in his mind, a thirst for knowledge about the world and his place in it. He studied rhetoric, learned the art of persuasion, and and even observed the Roman military, imagining how he might one day command legions of his own. Every detail mattered, every decision a thread in a tapestry he was beginning to weave. By the time he returned to Rome, Caesar was no longer just a boy from a struggling noble family. He was sharper, smarter, and ready to step into the dangerous arena of Roman politics. And as he walked the streets once familiar to him, he must have understood. The city that had threatened to destroy him could also be the place where he would rise to power, if only he had the courage to seize it. In this first chapter of his life, the lesson is clear. The world does not give power. It must be taken. And Julius Caesar was ready to take it. Rome was a city of whispers, shadows, and deadly ambition. But for one young man, it was also the stage where he would begin to write his name across history. Chapter 2. Learning the Game of Power. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome, he stepped into a world far more dangerous than the countryside where he had spent his exile. The city itself was alive with ambition, whispers of betrayal, and the constant buzz of political maneuvering. Every senator, every nobleman, every aspiring general had a plan, a network of loyalty, or a hidden dagger waiting for the right moment. For Caesar, survival alone was no longer enough. He needed influence, allies, and the ability to read the hearts of men. And quickly. From the start, Caesar displayed a rare combination of charm and cunning. He studied the art of rhetoric, learning to speak not just to the ears, but to the hearts of the Roman people. Public speaking in the Forum became his laboratory. Each word, each gesture, carefully crafted to inspire admiration, loyalty, or fear. He understood something that others often overlooked. In Rome, persuasion could be as deadly as a sword. A well-placed word could topple rivals, build alliances, or set a man on a path to glory or to ruin. But charisma alone would not be enough. Caesar also formed calculated relationships with the most powerful men in Rome. He befriended generals and politicians, sometimes charming them, sometimes intimidating them. Every alliance was a careful gamble, and every public act, attending games, supporting the poor, speaking in the Senate, was a signal to the people. I am here, I am ambitious, and I will not be ignored. Even in these early days, it was clear that Caesar was not just participating in politics, he was learning to bend Rome itself to his vision. Amid the grandeur and ceremony, danger never left his side. Rival politicians watched his every move, seeking any misstep to exploit. Enemies whispered in shadows, plotting against him. The lessons he had learned during exile, caution, observation, and swift decision-making, became vital tools. He began to understand that power was not merely about strength or popularity. It was about knowing when to speak, when to act, and when to wait. But Caesar's ambition was not only political. He craved military experience, knowing that in Rome, generals could command respect that words alone could never achieve. He sought opportunities to lead troops, to prove himself on the battlefield, and to show Rome that he was not only clever, but courageous. Every campaign, every minor victory, every display of strategic skill was another thread in the growing tapestry of his reputation. Yet, even as he learned, he remained human. Doubts crept in. Every decision carried risk. Allies could betray him, rivals could destroy him. But what separated Caesar from so many others was his relentless focus. He studied, observed, and learned from every encounter. Rome was a school of power, and he was its most dedicated student. By the end of this chapter, Julius Caesar had transformed from a young nobleman returning from exile into a figure the city could no longer ignore. He was no longer merely surviving the dangers of Rome. He was beginning to master the game of power itself, and the people watching, whether senators, soldiers, or citizens in the forum, had begun to sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. A man was rising, one who would not be satisfied with mere influence, but who would one day reshape Rome forever. Chapter 3. The First Triumvirate. Rome in the 60s BC was a city of immense wealth, sprawling power, and ceaseless ambition. The Senate, once a council of noble deliberation, had become a battlefield of personalities and agendas. Into this storm stepped Julius Caesar, no longer just a young orator or promising politician, but a man who understood that allies could be more powerful than armies. To climb the heights of Roman politics, he would need more than skill or charm. He would need a pact, a combination of influence, loyalty, and ambition strong enough to bend Rome to his vision. This was the beginning of the First Triumvirate, a secret alliance that would shake the foundations of the Republic. On one side was Caesar himself, young, ambitious, and hungry for recognition. Opposite him were two of Rome's most powerful men: Pompey, a celebrated general whose victories had earned him fame and loyalty from the legions, and Crassus, a man whose wealth rivaled the coffers of the state, a financier who understood that money could purchase influence, loyalty, and fear in equal measure. Individually, each was powerful. Together, they were unstoppable, at least in theory. The formation of the triumvirate was not a public event. It took place behind closed doors, in the shadows of Rome's grand halls, whispered conversations over dinners, and subtle exchanges of promises and favors. Caesar offered political support for Pompey's ambitions, ensuring the Senate would back the general's interests. In turn, Pompey provided Caesar with legitimacy and protection from rivals. Crassus contributed his wealth, financing elections, campaigns, and the subtle manipulations that made power visible and tangible. In this careful balance, each man gained what he lacked, and the Republic itself became their chessboard. But the alliance was fragile. Rome was a city of betrayals, and the triumvirate depended on secrecy, trust, and timing. Every conversation, every public act could reveal weakness. Caesar understood the stakes. He had learned that survival and influence depended not only on force, but on subtlety, on knowing when to push and when to wait. The triumvirate was a test of patience as much as of ambition, and Caesar had become a master of both. Military campaigns, political speeches, and the public games were all tools in this grand strategy. Caesar cultivated an image of the benevolent leader, generous to the people, careful to honor tradition, yet daring to innovate. Pompey's reputation as a war hero lent credibility, while Crassus's wealth ensured that power could be wielded effectively. Together, the three men created a network of influence that allowed them to dominate elections, sway the Senate, and manipulate the narrative of Roman politics. Yet, beneath the surface, tension simmered. Each man was ambitious, each man coveted glory, and the balance was delicate. Caesar, however, was patient. He understood that history rewards those who wait for the right moment, and he was willing to play the long game. While Pompey basked in fame and Crassus flaunted wealth, Caesar quietly positioned himself, strengthening alliances, expanding influence, and preparing for the day when the Republic would have no choice but to acknowledge his ascendancy. By the end of this chapter, the First Triumvirate had changed Rome forever. It was a secret pact of power, a shadow government shaping events in a city that thought itself free. And in the midst of it all, Julius Caesar was no longer merely ambitious. He was a man destined to alter the course of history. The stage was set, the pieces in motion, and Rome itself was about to feel the quiet, unstoppable rise of one of its greatest leaders. Chapter 4. The Conquest of Gaul. By 58 BC, Julius Caesar had cemented his position as a rising star in Roman politics, but ambition alone could not satisfy him. Rome revered its generals, and Caesar understood that true power came not only from alliances and clever words, but from the loyalty of soldiers and the glory of military victory. It was time to step onto the battlefield, to prove that he could not only speak like a leader, but lead like a conqueror. And so began the Gallic Wars, a campaign that would define Caesar's name for centuries. The land of Gaul, roughly modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Italy, was a vast, untamed territory, home to numerous tribes who had never been unified and whose fierce independence had long resisted Rome's influence. To the Romans, it was a land of opportunity. To the Gallic people, it was a world of invaders threatening their way of life. For Caesar, it was a proving ground, a place where strategy, courage, and ambition would collide in a deadly dance. From the very first campaign, Caesar demonstrated extraordinary leadership. He did not merely command armies, he inspired them. His soldiers were loyal not because of rank alone, but because they believed in him. They marched across rivers, endured harsh winters, and fought in battles where failure meant death. And yet, Caesar's genius was not in brute force alone. It was in strategy, timing, and the ability to turn every situation to his advantage. He manipulated alliances between Gallic tribes, exploited rivalries, and used the terrain as a weapon, all while carefully chronicling his victories in letters to Rome, which would later bolster his reputation even further. The battles were brutal, and the victories, while glorious, came at tremendous cost. Villages burned, armies fell, and the landscape of Gaul was reshaped by war. Yet for every danger, Caesar saw opportunity. Each conquest strengthened his army, expanded Rome's territories, and cemented his authority. The Gallic Wars were not merely military campaigns. They were a stage upon which Caesar would display not only courage, but political genius. Every city captured, every tribe subdued, became a stepping stone toward unmatched power. But even as he triumphed, danger lurked. Rival generals watched closely, senators whispered accusations, and Rome's political scene simmered with jealousy and fear. Yet Caesar pressed forward, fully aware that military glory would shield him from political attacks, and that his soldiers' loyalty was the greatest armor a man could wear. The conquest of Gaul became more than a campaign. It was the forge in which Caesar's destiny was tempered. By the end of these campaigns, Julius Caesar had transformed from a promising politician into a legendary general. His reputation stretched across Europe, his legions revered him, and Rome could no longer ignore the rising force he had become. Yet, even in victory, Caesar knew that true power awaited elsewhere, in the heart of Rome itself. The battles in Gaul were over, but the stage was set for the next, most daring move of his life, crossing the Rubicon and challenging the very foundations of the Republic. Chapter 5. The night before the Rubicon. It was the winter of 49 BC, and Rome stood at a crossroads. Julius Caesar had spent years building power, commanding armies, and navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics. The Gallic Wars had given him fame, wealth, and unwavering loyalty from his soldiers. But now, he faced a decision that would define his legacy forever. Across the narrow river of the Rubicon lay the land of Italy, and beyond it, the heart of Rome itself. To cross it with an army was illegal, treasonous, and dangerous. The law forbade it. Yet Caesar knew that staying behind would mean stagnation, vulnerability, and the slow erosion of all he had worked for. On the eve of his fateful decision, the night was still. The campfires of his legions flickered against the cold darkness, the men restless yet obedient, waiting silently for the orders that could lead them into history or disaster. Caesar walked alone along the riverbank, listening to the whisper of the waters and the distant murmurs of his soldiers. He understood the weight of the moment. One step could ignite a civil war. One step could shatter the Republic. And yet, hesitation was not an option. Ambition demanded action. Destiny demanded courage. He thought of Rome, the Senate, the nobles who whispered behind closed doors, and the people who had watched him rise with awe and suspicion. He thought of Pompeii, once his ally, now an obstacle. He knew that time was running out, that every day spent waiting weakened his influence and strengthened his rivals. In the stillness of that night, Julius Caesar made a choice to cross the Rubicon and claim the destiny that awaited him. History would remember the words he never spoke aloud, yet they echoed through every heart that witnessed the moment. Alea iacta est, the die is cast. The decision was terrifying. Failure would mean death, disgrace, and the end of everything he had fought to achieve. But Caesar's courage was tempered by strategy. His legions were loyal, his plans meticulous, and his understanding of Rome's political chaos unparalleled. The soldiers sensed it too. There was no fear in their ranks, only trust and anticipation. They knew they followed a man who could turn audacity into triumph and history into legend. As dawn approached, the river lay calm, reflecting the pale light of the rising sun. Caesar gave the command, and the first legion stepped into the cold waters. One by one, the men followed, the ripples carrying them across a border that had always been forbidden. In that quiet crossing, the fate of Rome shifted forever. The Republic would never be the same. Civil war loomed on the horizon, and Julius Caesar's name would echo through the ages as both conqueror and visionary. And so ends this chapter of ambition, strategy, and courage. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, not merely as a general or politician, but as a man who would change the course of history. The stage was set for the fall of the old republic, the rise of a new power, and the legend of one man whose actions still resonate 2,000 years later. 2,000 years ago, there was a moment when one city ruled almost the entire known world. From the misty forests of Britain to the burning deserts of the Middle East, from the mountains of Spain to the banks of the Nile. One empire stood above them all. That empire was Rome. At its greatest moment, nearly 70 million people lived under Roman rule. Its armies were feared across continents, its roads stretched farther than any empire had ever built, and its power seemed almost unstoppable. And at the center of this extraordinary age stood one man, the Emperor Trajan. Under his leadership, Rome reached the largest territorial expansion in its entire history. But how did a single city grow into a superpower that dominated 3 continents? How did its armies conquer kingdom after kingdom? And how did its roads hold together one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen? Tonight, in the Midnight Empire series, we step back into the golden age of Rome, the moment when the Roman Empire stood at the absolute height of its power. Chapter 1. The moment Rome ruled the world. There was a moment in history when the power of Rome seemed almost limitless. If you had stood on a hill outside the city in the early 2nd century, you would have seen a place unlike anything the world had ever known. The streets of Rome were crowded with merchants, soldiers, travelers, and citizens from lands thousands of miles apart. Different languages filled the air, yet all of them lived under the same authority, the rule of Rome. At that time, the Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents. To the north, Roman soldiers guarded the wind-swept frontiers of Britain. To the west, the empire reached the rugged coasts of Spain and the Atlantic Ocean. To the east, Roman influence touched the ancient lands of Syria and Mesopotamia. And to the south, its borders followed the fertile banks of the Nile in Egypt. Nearly 70 million people lived inside these borders. For the ancient world, that number was almost unimaginable. But Rome's dominance was not just about size. It was about control, order, discipline, and a system that connected distant lands into a single empire. Roman laws governed cities thousands of miles apart. Roman coins circulated through markets from Africa to Europe. Roman governors ruled provinces where people had never even seen the city of Rome itself, yet still obeyed its authority. And everywhere you looked, the symbols of Roman power were present. Massive stone roads carried soldiers and trade across the empire. Fortresses guarded the borders. Cities filled with temples, baths, and amphitheaters stood as reminders of Roman wealth and engineering. But perhaps the most powerful symbol of Rome's strength was its army. The Roman legions were not just soldiers. They were a machine of discipline and precision. Highly trained, organized, and relentless, they had defeated kings, tribes, and rival empires for centuries. By the early 2nd century, few dared to challenge them. At the center of this vast system stood an emperor whose ambitions would push Rome to its greatest height, Trajan. During his reign, the empire would grow larger than ever before. Yet even at this moment of overwhelming strength, the story of Rome was not simply about conquest. It was about the creation of a world connected by power, roads, armies, and law. For a brief moment in history, Rome did not just dominate the map, it ruled the world. Chapter 2. The Rise of Emperor Trajan. Not every ruler of Rome was born in the heart of the empire. Some rose from its distant frontiers, places where the sound of marching legions was more common than the whispers of palace politics. One of those men would become the emperor who carried Rome to the height of its glory. His name was Trajan. Trajan was not born in the city of Rome. He came from the province of Hispania, in what is now modern Spain. In the 1st century, that alone made him unusual. Rome had ruled vast territories for generations, but the idea that someone from the provinces could one day rule the empire itself still felt extraordinary. Yet Trajan's life was shaped not by privilege, but by the discipline of the Roman army. His father had been a respected general, and from a young age, Trajan grew up around soldiers, fortresses, and the harsh realities of Rome's frontiers. He understood something many politicians in Rome did not. The strength of the empire depended on the loyalty of its legions. As a young officer, Trajan quickly earned the respect of the men who served under him. He shared their hardships, marched beside them across rough terrain, and never asked a soldier to endure something he would not face himself. Among Roman troops, That kind of leadership mattered. By the time he reached adulthood, Trajan had built a reputation as a capable commander and a disciplined leader. His career in the military steadily advanced, and eventually he became one of the most trusted generals serving under the Emperor Nerva. But Rome itself was facing uncertainty. When Nerva came to power in 96 AD, the empire had just emerged from political turmoil and assassination. Stability was fragile. The loyalty of the army was uncertain. The future of the empire hung in the balance. Nerva understood that Rome needed more than a ruler. It needed a leader who could command the respect of both the Senate and the legions. So, in a decision that would change history, Nerva adopted Trajan as his heir. It was a bold move. For the first time, the Roman Empire would be led by a man chosen for his ability rather than his bloodline. When Nerva died in 98 AD, Trajan became emperor, and with him, a new chapter of Roman power was about to begin. One that would push the empire farther, stronger, and more confident than it had ever been before. Chapter 3. The empire expands to its greatest size. Empires rarely stop growing on their own. They either expand or they begin to weaken. When Trajan became emperor, Rome was already powerful. Its borders stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Many rulers before him had chosen caution, focusing on maintaining what Rome already controlled. But Trajan believed Rome's strength was meant to move forward. And soon, the empire would grow larger than it had ever been. One of the greatest challenges facing Rome came from the north, beyond the Danube River. There, in the rugged mountains of Dacia, roughly modern-day Romania, ruled a determined and dangerous king named Decebalus. For years, Dacia had been a constant threat to Roman borders. Its warriors were fierce, its terrain difficult, and its king ambitious. Raids across the Danube had humiliated Roman authority more than once. For Trajan, allowing this threat to continue was not an option. In 101 AD, the Roman legions began their march. Thousands of soldiers crossed the Danube, carrying with them the unmatched discipline and engineering skill of Rome. Massive bridges were built, supply lines stretched deep into hostile territory, and the legions slowly pushed through the mountains. The war was brutal, but Roman determination proved stronger. After years of hard fighting, Dacia finally fell to Roman control. King Decebalus was defeated, and the region became a Roman province. The victory was more than symbolic. It brought enormous wealth to Rome. Dacia's gold mines poured resources into the empire, strengthening its economy and funding new projects across the Roman world. Yet Trajan's ambitions did not end there. Turning east, he launched campaigns against the powerful Parthian Empire, Rome's greatest rival in the region. Roman forces advanced through Armenia and deep into Mesopotamia, capturing cities that had stood outside Roman influence for centuries. At the height of these victories, Roman power stretched farther than ever before. From the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf, from the cold forests of northern Europe to the scorching deserts of Arabia, Rome had become one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. For the soldiers who marched under its banners, it must have felt like the empire had no limits. And for a brief moment in history, under the leadership of Trajan, Rome stood at the absolute peak of its territorial power. Chapter 4. The Power of the Roman Legions. What made Rome unstoppable? Was it the wealth of its cities, the authority of its emperors, or the vast lands under its control. In truth, the real strength of Rome marched on two legs, carried a shield and a sword, and wore iron armor beneath the burning sun and freezing rain. It was the Roman legionary. For centuries, the Roman legions were the backbone of the empire. Wherever Rome expanded, across mountains, deserts, rivers, and forests, it was the disciplined march of these soldiers that made victory possible. A Roman legion was not just a group of warriors. It was a carefully organized machine. Each legion usually contained around 5,000 soldiers, divided into smaller units that allowed commanders to move men quickly and efficiently in battle. Every soldier knew his place, his duty, and the man standing beside him. Training was relentless. Roman recruits spent months drilling with heavy shields and wooden swords that weighed more than real weapons. They marched long distances, carrying full equipment on their backs. They practiced building fortifications, digging trenches, and setting up camps with incredible speed. To outsiders, it might have seemed exhausting. But to Rome, this discipline created something extraordinary. When a Roman army arrived at the end of a long march, the soldiers did not simply rest. Instead, they built a fortified camp, walls, gates, and watchposts, often in a single evening. This routine protected the army and kept soldiers organized even in hostile territory. On the battlefield, the legions moved with precision, rows of shields locked together to form a defensive wall. Spears and short swords struck in coordinated bursts. Officers shouted commands while horns signaled movements across the battlefield. It was not chaos. It was controlled violence. This level of discipline allowed Roman armies to defeat enemies who were sometimes larger, faster, or more familiar with the terrain. Tribal warriors might charge with incredible courage, but against the steady formation of Roman legions, courage alone was rarely enough. The soldiers also carried more than weapons. They carried the identity of Rome itself. From Britain's cold northern frontiers to the deserts near the eastern borders, the sight of Roman standards rising above a legion camp reminded every province who truly held power. Under emperors like Trajan, these legions pushed the empire farther than ever before. Their discipline, loyalty, and endurance turned Rome from a powerful state into a military force that shaped the ancient world for generations. Chapter 5. Roads that connected an empire. How do you control an empire that stretches thousands of miles? How do you send orders, move armies, deliver supplies, and keep distant provinces loyal to a city they may never even see? For Rome, the answer was carved in stone, literally. Across mountains, valleys, forests, and deserts, the Romans built one of the most extraordinary road systems the ancient world had ever seen. By the height of the empire, more than 250,000 miles of roads connected its provinces, an achievement that would influence transportation and engineering for centuries. But these roads were not built for comfort. They were built for power. Roman engineers designed roads with remarkable precision. Layers of stone, gravel, and sand were carefully placed to create a surface strong enough to last for generations. Many of these roads were straight, cutting across landscapes with almost stubborn determination, refusing to bend even when the terrain became difficult. And because of this design, they endured. Some Roman roads are still visible today, but their greatest purpose was movement. The moment a rebellion started on a distant frontier or a threat appeared beyond the borders, Roman legions could march quickly across the empire. Orders from the emperor could travel faster than most people believed possible in the ancient world. In many ways, these roads were the empire's veins and arteries. They carried soldiers, merchants, travelers, and messengers from one corner of the Roman world to another. A merchant from North Africa could travel north into Europe. A soldier stationed in the east might eventually march west to the Atlantic coast. Every mile strengthened Rome's control. Along these roads, cities grew, markets expanded, ideas, languages, and cultures mixed in ways that had rarely happened before. For ordinary people living in distant provinces, these roads made the empire feel closer. A governor could arrive with authority. A caravan could bring goods from faraway lands. A Roman legion could appear at the gates of a troubled city within days. The message was clear. Rome was always connected. During the reign of emperors like Trajan, this vast network allowed the empire to function as a single system rather than scattered territories. Orders could be enforced, trade could flourish, and stability could spread across continents. Stone by stone, mile by mile, Rome built something greater than roads. It built the structure that held an empire together. Chapter 6: Wealth, Cities, and the Pax Romana. Imagine walking through the streets of Rome at its peak more than 2,000 years ago. The city thrummed with life. Merchants called out from colorful stalls, carrying spices, silks, and wine from across the empire. Children laughed as they played near fountains, while scholars and philosophers debated in shaded courtyards. The air smelled of bread from bakeries, incense from temples, and smoke from distant workshops. It was not just a city, it was the heartbeat of a world empire. This was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of stability and prosperity that lasted for decades. During this time, Rome was not only powerful in war, but also unmatched in wealth, culture, and civilization. For ordinary citizens, life felt safer, more predictable. Roads carried grain to feed the city. Aqueducts brought fresh water to fountains and baths. Public spaces were open, lively, and vibrant. The wealth of the empire flowed through its cities. Markets bustled with products from North Africa, Spain, and the Middle East. Artisans and craftsmen created jewelry, pottery, and textiles that dazzled the eyes. Coins minted in Rome traveled farther than ever, connecting villages, towns, and distant provinces into a single economic system. Yet wealth was more than money. It was power. Cities grew into centers of administration, culture, and influence. Architecture reached new heights. Majestic temples, amphitheaters, and forums showcased the empire's grandeur. The Colosseum echoed with the roar of crowds, a reminder that Rome was both a city and a symbol of civilization itself. Under emperors like Trajan, Rome became the anchor of this vast empire. Trade, law, and governance flourished, allowing creativity, knowledge, and culture to spread. People could travel across continents without fearing chaos at every turn, a stability unseen in much of the ancient world. The Pax Romana was more than peace. It was the quiet, powerful force that allowed Rome to shine at its greatest moment. Farmers, soldiers, merchants, and scholars all lived under its protective umbrella, contributing to a civilization that would influence generations to come. In this golden age, Rome was not just a city. It was the center of the known world, a civilization defined by wealth, culture, and enduring human achievement. For a fleeting but unforgettable period, Rome was more than an empire. It was the standard of civilization itself. Chapter 7: the peak of Roman power. There was a moment in history when Rome truly seemed untouchable. Under the rule of Trajan, the empire stretched from the windswept hills of Scotland to the deserts of Arabia. From the Atlantic coasts to the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, Rome's banners flew over lands that had never before felt the presence of a single ruler. It was the absolute peak of Roman power, a time when the empire was both vast and unshakably organized. What made this period extraordinary was not just size, but the way Rome managed its strength. Soldiers were loyal and disciplined. Roads and infrastructure tied distant provinces together. Cities thrived, trade flourished, and a shared law bound millions of people across continents. Every element of the empire worked in harmony, like the gears of a perfect machine. But beyond the strategy and discipline, there was a human story here, a story of leadership and vision. Trajan understood that power was fragile, if not nurtured. He led campaigns personally, often marching alongside his soldiers, sharing their hardships and victories. This connection between emperor and army inspired loyalty unlike any other. Soldiers did not just fight for Rome, they fought for the man who had earned their respect, a leader who shared their struggles and celebrated their triumphs. Rome's expansion under Trajan brought more than land. It brought wealth, security, and a sense of destiny. Provinces once isolated now sent grain to feed the city, artisans to inspire its culture, and soldiers to defend its borders. The empire's influence rippled beyond its territories, setting standards in law, engineering, and governance that would echo for centuries. This peak was not eternal, of course. Empires rise and fall, yet the lessons of Trajan's Rome endured. Military strategy, urban planning, trade networks, and governance developed during his reign influenced rulers, cities, and armies long after the legions had marched home. Even modern Europe carries traces of roads, laws, and institutions that began in this golden era. For a fleeting moment, the world was Roman, and the shadow of its power stretched farther than any human imagination could easily grasp. Under Trajan, Rome was not just a city or a state. It was the center of the known world, a civilization at its most confident, disciplined, and unstoppable. In the history of empires, few moments shine as brightly as this. For Rome, the age of Trajan was more than expansion. It was the embodiment of human ambition, strategy, and vision, a reminder of what one city and its people could achieve when everything aligned perfectly. History remembers Rome as the greatest empire on earth, but inside the imperial palace, the story was very different. Behind golden crowns and marble halls lived emperors feared even by their own guards. Some were worshipped as gods, others were killed by the people closest to them. Tonight, we uncover the secret life of Rome's emperors. Chapter 1. The Palace of Secrets. For the most powerful men in the ancient world, the greatest danger often lived inside their own home. High above the city of Rome stood the imperial palace on the legendary Palatine Hill. From here, the emperor ruled an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Marble halls gleamed under torchlight, fountains whispered in the courtyards, and servants moved quietly through endless corridors. To the outside world, it was a symbol of unmatched power and glory. But inside the palace walls, another reality existed. The palace was not just a home for the emperor. It was the political heart of the Roman Empire. Senators arrived with carefully chosen words. Generals waited for commands that could decide the fate of entire provinces. Messengers brought news from distant frontiers, from Britain to Syria. Every decision made inside these chambers could change the course of history. Yet with that power came something far darker: fear. Emperors quickly learned that absolute power created absolute enemies. Every ambitious senator, every overlooked general, and even members of the emperor's own family could become potential threats. In Rome, loyalty was often temporary, and trust was a rare luxury. At night, when the feasts were over and the torches burned low, the palace corridors grew quiet. But the danger never truly disappeared. Behind closed doors, whispers spread through the court. Servants carried rumors from one chamber to another. Advisors spoke in careful, guarded voices. A careless word could destroy a career, or worse, attract the suspicion of the emperor himself. For the emperor, sleep rarely came easily. Even surrounded by guards, many rulers knew that the most dangerous conspiracies were often born within the palace itself. The men assigned to protect the emperor, the powerful Praetorian Guard, were also capable of turning against him if the political winds shifted. History would prove this again and again. Several Roman emperors who ruled from this palace never expected the moment their power would suddenly end. A trusted ally could become an assassin. A loyal guard could become a conspirator. And a quiet conversation in a shadowed hallway could grow into a deadly plot. The palace on Palatine Hill looked magnificent to the citizens of Rome below. Its towering walls and golden roofs symbolized the strength of an empire that ruled the known world. But inside those walls, power was fragile. Because in Rome, the throne did not only grant absolute authority, it also placed a target on the emperor's back. Chapter 2. When power becomes madness. Absolute power can change a man. In ancient Rome, it sometimes destroyed him. When a new emperor first took the throne of the Roman Empire, hope often filled the air. Senators spoke of stability, citizens expected strong leadership, and soldiers pledged loyalty to their new ruler. Many emperors began their reign with promise, young, ambitious, and determined to prove themselves worthy of Rome's immense power. But ruling the greatest empire of the ancient world came with a burden few could truly handle. An emperor controlled the armies, the treasury, the laws, and even the lives of Rome's citizens. His word could build cities, start wars, or condemn powerful men to death. In theory, the Senate still existed, but in reality, the emperor stood above almost everyone. And when one person holds that much authority, something dangerous can begin to happen. Isolation. Inside the imperial palace on Palatine Hill, emperors slowly became separated from the ordinary world. Their days were filled with ceremonies, advisors, and endless political tension. Every visitor approached them carefully, often speaking only the words they believed the emperor wanted to hear. Honest criticism became rare. Instead, the emperor heard constant praise, sometimes genuine, but often driven by fear. Courtiers applauded every decision. Poets praised the emperor's wisdom. Officials competed to prove their loyalty. Over time, this environment could distort reality itself. When no one dares to challenge your decisions, it becomes easy to believe you are always right. When thousands of people bow before you, it becomes easy to believe you are more than human. For some Roman emperors, this transformation happened slowly. Suspicion began to replace trust. Advisors who once seemed loyal suddenly appeared dangerous. Friends became potential rivals. Even family members could look like threats to the throne. Paranoia spread through the palace like a silent disease. Emperors began surrounding themselves with guards, watching the behavior of senators, and listening carefully to rumors whispered through the court. A careless comment, a political disagreement, or even a strange look could spark deadly consequences. And as fear grew, the emperor's behavior sometimes grew stranger as well. Lavish celebrations became more extravagant. Punishments became harsher. Decisions that once seemed rational turned unpredictable. What had once been a confident ruler could slowly transform into a man driven by suspicion, anger, or obsession. The Roman court understood this pattern all too well. Senators and officials watched carefully, knowing that the emperor's mood could determine their survival. A ruler admired one year could become feared the next, because in Rome, the line between powerful leader and dangerous ruler was often very thin. And once that line was crossed, the entire empire would feel the consequences. Chapter 3: Caligula, Rome's most unpredictable emperor. What happens when the most powerful man in the world stops believing he is human? In the year 37 AD, a young ruler stepped onto the throne of the Roman Empire. His name was Caligula, and at first, the people of Rome welcomed him with hope and celebration. The young emperor had grown up around soldiers and military camps, earning the affectionate nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, from the tiny army sandals he wore as a child. To many Romans, he seemed energetic, charismatic, and ready to lead the empire into a new era. But the promise of his early reign would not last long. Only months after becoming emperor, Caligula suffered a severe illness. Ancient historians later wrote that when he recovered, something about him seemed different. Whether it was illness, the crushing pressure of power, or simply his true personality finally emerging, the emperor's behavior began to shock the entire Roman court. Caligula did not merely rule Rome, he demanded to be worshipped. According to several ancient sources, he began presenting himself as a living god. Statues of deities were sometimes altered to resemble his face. Temples were ordered to honor him, and courtiers were expected to treat the emperor not just as a ruler, but as a divine figure. For the proud Roman elite, this was deeply humiliating. The senators of Rome had long seen themselves as guardians of the republic's ancient traditions. Even under the emperors, they still believed they deserved respect and influence. Caligula, however, seemed to enjoy challenging and mocking their authority. At public gatherings, he reportedly insulted powerful senators. He forced members of the elite to run beside his chariot during ceremonial processions. Some historians even describe elaborate banquets where the emperor treated Rome's most important men like nervous performers in his personal theater. Inside the imperial palace on Palatine Hill, fear began to spread. No one could predict what the emperor might do next. One day he might reward a courtier with wealth and honors. The next day he might accuse that same person of disloyalty. In an empire where the emperor's word carried absolute authority, even a rumor could become a death sentence. As Caligula's rule continued, the tension inside Rome's political circles grew more dangerous. Behind closed doors, senators whispered about the emperor's behavior. Advisors spoke cautiously, measuring every word. And within the powerful Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers responsible for protecting the emperor began to question their loyalty. Because in Rome, when a ruler became too unpredictable, survival sometimes meant removing him. And for Caligula, the palace that once symbolized his absolute power would soon become the place where his reign and his life came to a sudden and violent end. Chapter 4. Nero and the Theater of Power. What do you do when you are emperor of the world, but your heart belongs to the stage? In the year 54 AD, Nero ascended to the throne of the Roman Empire, a young man full of ambition, charm, and energy. To the public, he promised stability and greatness. Yet, behind the palace walls, a very different story unfolded. One where art, obsession, and political danger collided. Nero was not like the emperors who came before him. While the empire demanded careful governance, military strategy, and lawmaking, he found his passion in music, poetry, and performance. He sang on stage, played the lyre, and even competed in public contests, acts considered inappropriate for someone who ruled the most powerful empire on earth. The citizens of Rome were both fascinated and disturbed. To see an emperor perform on stage, dressed in costume, seemed absurd to many. Senators and generals, who had been accustomed to more disciplined leadership, whispered their disapproval in the shadowed corridors of the imperial palace on Palatine Hill. But Nero's love of performance was only part of his story. Power in Rome was never simple. His court was filled with intrigue, and enemies lurked behind every corner. Advisors, family members, and senators all jostled for influence, each seeking to bend the young emperor to their will, or remove him entirely. The infamous fire of 64 AD became one of the defining moments of Nero's reign. As the city of Rome burned, rumors spread that Nero himself had played the lyre while watching the flames consume the city. Whether true or exaggerated by historians, the stories cemented his reputation as a ruler more concerned with spectacle than governance. The fire also provided an opportunity for Nero to target political rivals, blaming Christians and other groups for the disaster and solidifying his control through fear and propaganda. Within the palace, tension was constant. Advisors carefully measured every word they spoke. Senators moved with caution, aware that the emperor's favor could vanish overnight. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect Nero, were also drawn into the swirling conspiracies and plots, forced to navigate the emperor's unpredictability. Nero's reign demonstrates the fragile line between brilliance and madness. His life was a theater where art and absolute power collided, and the empire itself became a stage for his ambitions, desires, and fears. In the end, the story of Nero shows that ruling Rome was not just about commanding armies or making laws. It was about surviving the whispers, rumors, and plots that constantly surrounded the throne. Because in the empire's glittering palace, the show was never over, and the consequences of missteps could be fatal. Chapter 5. Conspiracies in the Dark. In Rome, the closest ally could be the deadliest enemy. The imperial palace on Palatine Hill was more than a home. It was a battlefield. Beneath its gilded ceilings and lavish decorations, whispers of betrayal echoed through every corridor. Senators, generals, and even trusted guards plotted in silence, knowing that the emperor's favor could vanish overnight. In this palace, power was intoxicating, but danger was constant. For centuries, the Roman throne had been both the ultimate prize and the deadliest trap. Emperors who commanded armies, controlled wealth, and dictated law also lived under the constant threat of betrayal. No one knew this better than the elite within the palace walls. Senators, who once debated policies in the open courts of Rome, now whispered in shadowed hallways, their words carefully chosen. Ambitious generals who had won victories for Rome quietly weighed the risks of loyalty versus ambition. and the Praetorian Guard, charged with the emperor's protection, often became the hidden instruments of conspiracy. Plots took many forms. Some were subtle, carefully planted rumors, secret alliances, or favors granted and revoked to manipulate influence. Others were deadly, poisoned cups, ambushes in dimly lit corridors, or carefully timed assassinations. A single misstep, a word spoken out of turn, could mean exile, disgrace, or death. Even emperors who seemed secure were not immune. Caligula, for example, was known for his unpredictability, but even he feared those around him. Nero, obsessed with performance and indulgence, became surrounded by scheming officials who waited for any sign of weakness. And the palace itself became a chessboard where every player calculated their move with deadly precision. The danger was not always obvious. Smiles in the dining hall could mask daggered intentions. Servants who appeared loyal often served multiple masters. Advisors who spoke kindly in the morning might conspire by night. In Rome, it was not the battles on distant frontiers that toppled emperors. It was the quiet, invisible war waged within their own palace. Conspiracies also bred paranoia. Emperors learned to trust almost no one. Guards watched the movements of courtiers. Senators watched each other. Every glance, every whisper, every delayed bow could signal a brewing plot. The lines between friend and foe blurred, and the emperor's life became a constant test of perception and intuition. By the end of the day, the palace stood as a monument not only to Rome's power, but also to its peril. Golden walls and marble floors hid secrets darker than any battlefield. Because in the heart of the empire, survival depended less on strength or strategy, and more on navigating the shadows of human ambition. In Rome, the greatest threat to an emperor was rarely a foreign army. It was the hand reaching out from the dark, just beside him. Chapter 6. The Night of Assassins. In Rome, the night could be deadlier than the battlefield. For the emperors of the Roman Empire, power came with luxury, but also a price few could imagine. Behind the palace walls on Palatine Hill, assassination was not an occasional threat. It was a constant reality. Every shadow could hide a conspirator. Every cup might carry poison, and every whispered conversation could end a reign. Throughout history, many rulers ascended the throne only to discover that survival depended as much on vigilance as on strategy. Some emperors, like Caligula and Nero, surrounded themselves with guards and advisors, but that protection could quickly turn fatal. The same men sworn to defend. The emperor could be persuaded, bribed, or coerced into striking the fatal blow. The methods of assassination were as varied as they were sinister. Poisoned wine or meals were a favorite tool, simple, silent, and often impossible to trace. Daggers hidden in clothing allowed conspirators to strike at close range, leaving no witnesses but the dying emperor. Even staged accidents, from falls to manipulated chariots, were employed to remove rulers without the scandal of open bloodshed. Palace coups were another common threat. Generals or senators could rally supporters in secret, seizing key parts of the city to control access to the emperor. Guards loyal to the conspirators might block exits, isolate the ruler, and ensure that no help could arrive in time. These events often unfolded in complete darkness, leaving little room for the emperor to defend himself. Fear was constant. Emperors learned to sleep lightly, to question every gesture, and to doubt the loyalty of those closest to them. Even family members could pose a threat. Brothers, uncles, or ambitious children might see assassination as a path to power. In Rome, trust was a dangerous gamble, and the wrong decision could be fatal. The psychological toll of this constant danger was immense. Some emperors became paranoid, isolated, and unpredictable. Others, aware of the threats surrounding them, grew cold, calculating, and merciless, believing that only preemptive strikes could ensure survival. The palace, with its golden walls and opulent halls, became a prison where life and death were decided by intrigue and guile rather than strength or honor. By sunrise, the emperor who survived the night might appear unshaken, but the shadow of assassination always lingered. Those who fell became cautionary tales, remembered for their power and for the sudden, violent ends they met in the very palace that symbolized Rome's glory. In the empire's heart, the night was never quiet. It was a theater of danger where the price of absolute power was measured in lives, and no emperor could ever afford to sleep peacefully. Chapter 7. The Price of Absolute Power. Power is intoxicating, but in Rome, it came with a deadly price. The emperors of the Roman Empire ruled over the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. From the rolling hills of Britain to the deserts of Egypt, their word was law. Their decisions shaped the lives of millions, and their wealth seemed limitless. Yet behind the grandeur of their palaces on Palatine Hill, a far darker reality defined their existence: fear. Absolute authority offered unimaginable freedom, but it also isolated rulers from everyone around them. Friends became rivals, family became potential enemies, and even the men sworn to protect them, the Praetorian Guard, could be bribed, coerced, or persuaded to turn against them. Trust was a luxury few emperors could afford. History shows that many who sought power underestimated this danger. Caligula trusted few and alienated many, yet even he was eventually struck down by those closest to him. Nero pursued personal passions at the expense of statecraft, leaving conspiracies to fester unchecked around him. In Rome, the higher one climbed, the steeper and deadlier the fall. The palace itself symbolized this paradox. Marble halls, golden ceilings, and lavish feasts projected strength and stability to the outside world. But inside, the corridors were silent witnesses to plotting, paranoia, and betrayal. Emperors were never truly alone, yet the company they kept often brought danger closer than any foreign enemy could. Even the simplest decisions could have fatal consequences. A favor given to one courtier might anger another. A policy meant to strengthen the empire could trigger a conspiracy. In a world where assassination, poison, and coups were common tools, the line between power and vulnerability was razor thin. This constant threat shaped the emperors psychologically as much as it did politically. Many grew cautious, calculating, and suspicious, seeing enemies in every shadow. Some embraced cruelty as a defense, striking first before being struck. Others retreated into art, indulgence, or madness, seeking escape from the relentless tension of ruling an empire. And yet, despite the danger, Rome's emperors continued to seize the throne. For power was irresistible, even when it meant walking a path lined with peril. Every decision carried weight, every moment held risk, and every sunrise brought new challenges, and sometimes new assassins. The history of Rome teaches a harsh truth. The throne that promised ultimate power also guaranteed vulnerability. To rule the world was to live constantly on the edge of fear, where every whisper could threaten a life and every ally could hide a dagger. In the end, absolute power may seem glorious, but in the heart of Rome, it always came at the highest possible cost. One ordinary morning in the Roman Empire, A prosperous city woke up beneath the shadow of a quiet mountain. Children played in the streets. Merchants opened their shops. Life moved as it always had. But within hours, the sky would turn black, the earth would tremble, and an entire city would vanish from the world. This is the story of the day Pompeii disappeared beneath the fury of Mount Vesuvius. Tonight on Midnight Empire, we travel back to the Roman world to witness one of history's most haunting catastrophes, the destruction of Pompeii in eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. Through the voices of survivors and the ruins left behind, we uncover how an entire city vanished in a single day. Chapter 1. A city of pleasure and power. Before the ash, before the darkness, before the mountain unleashed its fury, there was a city filled with laughter, ambition, and life. In the shadow of the silent volcano, Mount Vesuvius, the thriving Roman city of Pompeii, stood as a symbol of prosperity. To its citizens, it was not a place of danger. It was home. In the 1st century, Pompeii was one of the most vibrant cities of the Roman Empire. Nestled near the sparkling waters of the Bay of Naples, the city was alive with trade, culture, and opportunity. Nearly 20,000 people called it home. Merchants, artisans, farmers, politicians, slaves, and wealthy elites whose influence reached far beyond the city's walls. The streets were paved with stone and echoed with the sounds of everyday life. Vendors shouted their offers in crowded markets. Bakers pulled warm loaves from stone ovens. The scent of olive oil, wine, and freshly cooked food drifted through narrow alleyways. But Pompeii was more than just a trading hub. It was a city that celebrated pleasure. Elegant villas lined the streets, their walls painted with vibrant frescoes that told stories of gods, heroes, and romance. Courtyards bloomed with gardens, fountains trickled softly, and marble statues stood proudly beneath the Mediterranean sun. For the wealthy, life here was a display of power and comfort. Lavish banquets filled long dining rooms, where guests reclined on cushioned couches while servants poured wine from distant vineyards. Conversations flowed late into the night about politics, philosophy, and the ever-expanding reach of Rome. Public life was just as grand. Citizens gathered in bathhouses not only to cleanse their bodies, but to exchange news, gossip, and ideas. Steam rose from heated pools, while laughter echoed beneath towering arches. Nearby, the city's amphitheater roared with excitement as crowds cheered for gladiators locked in combat. Every corner of Pompeii reflected the strength and confidence of Roman civilization. It was a place where ambition thrived and where people believed the future belonged to them. Yet, towering quietly above this lively world stood Mount Vesuvius. For generations, the mountain had remained silent. Its slopes were green with vineyards and farms, giving no hint of the power sleeping beneath the earth. To the people of Pompeii, it was simply part of the landscape, a mountain, a backdrop to their lives. But history was about to reveal a terrifying truth. The mountain had been watching all along. Chapter 2. The Silent Giant. For centuries, Mount Vesuvius loomed over Pompeii like a patient guardian, or perhaps a silent predator. Its green slopes and fertile vineyards seemed harmless, a source of life. Yet deep beneath the surface, a restless power stirred, unnoticed by those who called its shadow home. Long before the bustling streets of Pompeii, Mount Vesuvius had a history written in fire and ash. Ancient records whisper of violent eruptions hundreds of years before the city flourished, but to the Romans, those stories had faded into legend. They saw only its fertile slopes, the rich soil that fed their crops and vineyards. To the ordinary citizen, the mountain was part of everyday life, a backdrop to sunrise walks, market chatter, and children playing in sunlit streets. Farmers planted olives and grapes on its slopes, their labor rewarded with abundant harvests. Merchants traded in its shadow, lovers strolled along its base. Life felt eternal here, as if the mountain's silence was a promise of safety. Yet nature had already sent warnings. Minor tremors occasionally shook the city, enough to rattle pots and awaken dogs, yet never enough to provoke fear. Strange clouds sometimes curled around the peak, and hot springs bubbled up in unusual places. Some locals whispered of ominous signs, tales of small fires in the hills or rivers of mud that had appeared and disappeared. But these warnings were easily dismissed. Life, after all, was precious, and immediate concerns outweighed distant fears. Even scholars and priests, trained in reading omens and signs, often shrugged at these subtle hints. Many Romans believed the gods watched over them, protecting the empire from sudden destruction. Faith in Rome's power and in the stability of their world dulled their senses. A city as confident and thriving as Pompeii could hardly imagine that the very mountain it revered could become the instrument of its annihilation. So the giant slept, or at least it appeared to. But beneath the surface, molten rock churned. Pressure built in the mountain's belly, moving silently through underground chambers and ancient tubes. The giant, ignored and underestimated, was awakening. And when it finally erupted, the people of Pompeii would learn that ignoring the signs of nature can have catastrophic consequences. The mountain had been waiting patiently for its moment, and that moment was closer than anyone dared to imagine. Chapter 3: The Day the Sky Exploded. It began as a low rumble beneath the earth, a warning so subtle that most dismissed it as an ordinary tremor. But soon, the sky itself betrayed the mountain. Smoke and fire erupted, turning daylight into a shadowed nightmare. The mountain was no longer sleeping. It was hungry. On that fateful morning in Pompeii, life started like any other day. Merchants set up their stalls, children ran through the sunlit streets, and the scent of fresh bread filled the air. But somewhere, deep beneath the city, Mount Vesuvius began to awaken. A black cloud, heavy and unnatural, rose from the peak, curling into the sky like a monstrous hand reaching for the sun. People stopped, pointing, whispering, uncertain if it was smoke, storm, or something far worse. Within minutes, ash began to fall. Fine at first, like dust, but quickly thickening, stinging skin and filling lungs. Dogs barked frantically, horses bolted. Panic rippled through the city like wildfire. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Mothers clutched their children. Slaves ran through alleys, their eyes wide with fear. The once vibrant streets of Pompeii became chaotic, a blur of terrified faces and desperate footsteps. The air grew thick and choking, carrying the smell of sulfur and burnt vegetation. Roof tiles cracked under the weight of accumulating ash, sending shards crashing to the streets below. People who had lived all their lives in the shadow of the mountain now realized its power and its wrath. Some tried to flee toward the coast, hoping the sea would save them. Others sought shelter in their homes, clutching treasures they would never escape with. Friends called to each other, shouting over the growing roar. But in minutes, the voices of the living were drowned beneath the mountain's fury. The city that had once celebrated laughter, wealth, and pleasure now faced the unrelenting might of nature. Ash fell in relentless sheets, darkening the sun, coating bodies, streets, and buildings. The sky, once a serene blue, was now an ominous gray, a warning written in stone and fire. By the time the day had reached its peak, Pompeii was already disappearing beneath the wrath of Mount Vesuvius. The joyous city, so full of life, now teetered on the edge of oblivion. Every heartbeat, every scream, every desperate attempt to survive became a story lost in the shadow of the exploding sky. The mountain had spoken, and its message was clear. No one could escape. Chapter 4: Darkness at Noon. The sun was high, yet the city was swallowed by night. Ash blanketed the streets. The air burned in every breath. What had started as a warning had become a living nightmare. In Pompeii, daylight died while panic ruled, and every soul fought for survival. By mid-morning, Pompeii was unrecognizable. The streets were no longer filled with laughter or the hum of daily trade. Ash fell like snow, black and suffocating, coating every surface. Buildings groaned under its weight, wooden shutters splintered, and rooftops collapsed without warning. The once familiar city had transformed into a maze of destruction. People ran blindly, clutching children, pets, and whatever belongings they could carry. Parents shouted for lost sons and daughters. Servants dragged the elderly through alleyways, stumbling over debris as the ground shook violently beneath them. The tremors, small at first, had grown into relentless earthquakes that ripped through streets and buildings alike. Stones and pottery tumbled like rain. Panic became a language everyone spoke fluently. From the city's forum to the villas on its outskirts, fear painted every face. Some froze, paralyzed by disbelief, watching neighbors vanish beneath falling beams and clouds of choking ash. Others screamed, their voices swallowed by the roar of the mountain and the crashes of crumbling walls. Horses bolted, carts overturned, and smoke from ignited fires added another layer of terror to the already suffocating gloom. In the chaos, human bravery and fragility collided. A mother shielded her infant with her body, a young man lifted debris to free a trapped neighbor, and an old man whispered prayers to gods who had failed to warn them. Every heartbeat mattered. Every choice, whether to run, hide, or help, was a gamble with death. Above all, the mountain loomed like a silent predator. Plumes of ash and gas darkened the sky, and rocks rained down, scorching roofs and streets. The familiar streets of Pompeii twisted into a labyrinth of fear and destruction. In those hours, the city's rhythm, once lively, joyous, and predictable, was replaced by chaos and desperation. Families were torn apart, friends vanished in an instant, and while daylight continued to struggle against the ash, the people of Pompeii realized that the day's horrors were far from over. The sun might have still been above the horizon, but darkness had claimed the city. The world they knew was slipping through their fingers. One collapsing building, one desperate scream, one suffocating breath at a time. Chapter 5: The Final Hours of Pompeii. In the blink of an eye, the mountain's wrath became unstoppable. A wave of fire, rock, and ash surged through the city, and Pompeii went from chaos to silence. Minutes became eternity. Life, once vibrant, ended in a heartbeat. By afternoon, the terror that had begun with falling ash escalated into something far more lethal. Mount Vesuvius unleashed pyroclastic surges, blinding clouds of gas, rock, and molten debris that raced down its slopes at unimaginable speed. These were not gentle warnings. They were death incarnate, moving faster than anyone could run, hotter than any fire, and merciless in their destruction. People who had survived tremors, collapsing rooftops, and choking ash now faced a force they could neither hide from nor fight. Families clung together, hearts pounding, as the surges tore through streets and homes. The air itself seemed to ignite. Those who inhaled it felt their lungs sear. Breath became agony. Panic turned to a desperate, silent terror as citizens realized there was no escape. Some fled toward the city gates, hoping for salvation in open roads. Others tried to shelter inside their homes, barricading doors and clinging to loved ones. But the surges moved like predators, filling every alley, every square, every courtyard, with a force that respected no walls, no doors, no pleas. In minutes, homes and markets, temples and bathhouses, everything that had defined Pompeii was reduced to ruins and ash. Amid the devastation, human moments remained. Mothers shielded children, lovers held each other in silent terror, and strangers reached out to help one another, even as hope slipped away. Each heartbeat was precious, each breath a stolen gift, and each glance at the encroaching cloud a reminder of the fragility of life. By the time the surges had passed, the city that had once thrived in laughter, trade, and pleasure was gone. Streets were buried under meters of ash and pumice. Buildings were leveled, their walls etched only in memory, and the fragile impressions of those who had perished. The air was thick with silence, an unnatural, suffocating stillness. The final hours of Pompeii were merciless, swift, and absolute. In less than a single day, a vibrant Roman city, its markets, baths, villas, and lives had been erased. The survivors, if any, would only tell whispers of what happened. In the shadow of the sleeping giant, the once great city ceased to exist. History would remember it, but for those caught in that day, life ended not with a warning, but in the roaring silence of fire and ash. Chapter 6. Buried for 1,700 years. For centuries, Pompeii lay in silence, a city frozen in time. Its streets, homes, and the echoes of thousands of lives were buried beneath ash and pumice. The world forgot it existed, but beneath the surface, history waited patiently to be discovered. After the fury of Mount Vesuvius subsided, Pompeii vanished from the memory of the living. Thick layers of ash and rock had buried the city so completely that its existence became legend, a whisper in the records of Roman historians. For nearly 1,700 years, the city remained hidden beneath the slopes of the volcano, its streets and villas entombed, preserved as if time itself had paused. Above, life continued. Villages rose and fell, empires expanded and collapsed, and generations of people walked unknowingly over the sleeping city. Farmers tilled the soil, travelers passed by, and children played where markets and baths had once thrived, unaware that below their feet lay the remains of thousands of lives suddenly halted. Despite the disappearance of Pompeii from human memory, the city had not vanished entirely. The ash acted as a protective shell, preserving frescoes, mosaics, inscriptions, and even everyday objects with astonishing detail. Streets, furniture, and the hollow impressions of human bodies told stories of the final moments in a way that no written account could. In these silent remains, we find the human heartbeat of a city long gone, the laughter of children in frescoes, the careful arrangement of a merchant's stall, the hurried exit of a family trying to survive. It all remained, trapped beneath layers of earth. The tragedy of Pompeii became frozen art, a snapshot of ordinary lives cut short, waiting for the world to remember. And then, slowly, centuries later, curiosity and the drive to uncover the past brought explorers and archaeologists to the site. With each layer excavated, they revealed fragments of the city's soul, its people, their homes, and the sudden violence that had ended it all. What had seemed lost forever returned to light, whispering stories of human resilience, ambition, and vulnerability. Pompeii had disappeared from history, but in its ashes lay the deepest truths of life in the Roman world, reminding us that even in death, life leaves a trace. Beneath centuries of silence, the city waited patiently until the world was ready to listen. Chapter 7. The City, that time preserved. Imagine walking through a city where time stopped 2,000 years ago. Every street, every home, every frozen moment whispers stories of lives interrupted. This is Pompeii, the city that refused to be forgotten. When explorers first began to uncover Pompeii in the 18th century, they were stepping into a time capsule. Beneath layers of ash and pumice lay streets, villas, and public spaces that seemed untouched by centuries. Each discovery revealed the rhythm of Roman life, its wealth, its pleasures, its fears, and its sudden, tragic end. As archaeologists carefully brushed away centuries of earth, frescoes burst into view, vibrant with color. The walls of homes told intimate stories. Mythological scenes danced alongside depictions of daily life. Merchants' inscriptions advertised their wares. Children's footprints were preserved in plaster. Even the objects of ordinary life, pots, coins, jewelry, spoke of the dreams and routines of a people frozen in time. Perhaps most haunting were the casts of victims, created when ash hardened around bodies. The hollow spaces captured final gestures, hands raised in defense, couples clutching each other, families huddled in fear. These silent witnesses gave humanity to the disaster, turning statistics into stories, turning tragedy into empathy. Walking through Pompeii today, one can imagine the sounds of a bustling city, the chatter of markets, the laughter of children, the echoes of music from a nearby villa. And then one remembers the mountain looming in the distance and the abrupt silence that claimed all of it. Beyond its tragedy, Pompeii offered insight into the ingenuity and sophistication of Roman civilization. Roads were planned with precision, homes had running water and private baths, theaters and forums reflected a society rich in culture and civic life. Even in catastrophe, the city preserved a testament to human creativity and resilience. The rediscovery of Pompeii allowed the world to see history not as dates and names, but as lived experience. Every corner of the city reminded visitors that life is fragile, yet its traces endure. Pompeii's silence became its voice. Its sudden end immortalized its stories. And through its ruins, we are reminded that even in the face of unimaginable disaster, human life, its joys, fears, and ordinary moments can resonate across millennia, speaking to anyone willing to listen. The city that time preserved is not just a relic. It is a mirror showing us both the brilliance and fragility of life and the enduring power of memory. The greatest empire the world had ever known didn't fall in a thunderous battle. It ended quietly, when a teenage emperor was forced to surrender his crown. Tonight, we step into the final chapter of Rome, and the story of the boy who became its last ruler. Tonight on Midnight Empire, we enter the final days of the Western Roman Empire. A once unstoppable superpower is collapsing from within. Armies rebel, provinces fall, and a teenage emperor sits on a fading throne. This is the quiet, haunting story of how Rome, after centuries of dominance, finally reached its end. Chapter 1. The Empire that Ruled the World. For centuries, one name commanded the world's respect and fear. Rome, from the misty forests of northern Europe to the burning deserts of North Africa, from the rugged mountains of Spain to the wealthy cities of the eastern Mediterranean. One empire ruled them all. At its height, the Roman Empire controlled millions of people, hundreds of cities, and thousands of miles of roads. Its legions marched with unmatched discipline, carrying the power of Rome to every corner of the known world. The Mediterranean Sea itself became known as Mare Nostrum, our sea. Roman engineers built roads so strong that many still exist today. Their aqueducts carried fresh water into massive cities. Their laws shaped the foundations of modern justice. Their armies, feared across continents, expanded Rome's borders for centuries. And at the center of this vast empire stood the eternal city, Rome. A city of marble temples, towering monuments, and roaring crowds inside the Colosseum. Here, emperors ruled with absolute authority. Their word could raise armies, shape laws, and decide the fate of entire nations. For generations, powerful rulers like Augustus had transformed Rome from a fragile republic into a global superpower. Stability, wealth, and military dominance allowed the empire to thrive for hundreds of years. But even the greatest empires are not immortal. By the 5th century, the world that Rome once controlled was beginning to slip away. Provinces grew restless. Armies fought for rival leaders. Corruption and political chaos spread through the heart of the empire. Beyond Rome's borders, powerful tribes were gathering, watching, waiting. Among them were the Germanic warriors who had once served Rome as soldiers. Now they were growing stronger, demanding land, power, and a place inside the empire itself. The mighty empire that once conquered the world was no longer expanding. It was struggling to survive. Soon, the throne of Rome would be occupied by a young and inexperienced ruler, Romulus Augustulus, a boy emperor. And with him, the final chapter of Rome would begin. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Imperial Throne. Empires rarely collapse in a single moment. They crumble slowly, piece by piece. By the 5th century, the once mighty Roman Empire was no longer the unstoppable force it had been for centuries. The vast system that once brought stability and order to millions was beginning to fracture. The signs of decline were everywhere. Emperors rose to power and fell just as quickly. Many ruled only for a few years before being overthrown, assassinated, or replaced by ambitious generals. The imperial throne, once a symbol of absolute authority, had become dangerously unstable. Political chaos gripped the western half of the empire. Powerful military commanders often held more influence than the emperors themselves. Armies loyal to their generals could decide who ruled Rome, turning the empire into a battlefield of rival ambitions. Meanwhile, the empire's borders were under constant pressure. For centuries, Roman legions had defended long frontiers stretching across Europe, but now those defenses were weakening. Along the Rhine and Danube rivers, Germanic tribes pushed closer and closer to Roman territory. Some came as invaders, others came as refugees. One of the most dramatic turning points came during the Battle of Adrianople, when Roman forces suffered a devastating defeat against the Goths. The battle shocked the empire. For the first time in centuries, Rome realized that its enemies were no longer easily defeated. After that moment, the empire increasingly relied on foreign warriors to fill its ranks. Germanic soldiers were recruited as mercenaries, fighting inside Roman armies. Many became powerful commanders, gaining influence within the empire they once fought against. At the same time, the western provinces were slipping away. Britain had already been abandoned. Much of Gaul and Spain were falling under the control of new barbarian kingdoms. In North Africa, Rome had lost vital grain supplies after the Vandals seized the region. The Western government was growing weaker every year. While the eastern half of the empire, centered in Constantinople, remained wealthy and stable, the western capital struggled to maintain authority. By the middle of the 5th century, the empire that once ruled the Mediterranean had been reduced to a fragile shadow of its former glory. And soon, a child would be placed on the imperial throne, a young ruler who would unknowingly become the final emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus. Chapter 3: The Rise of a Boy Emperor. What if the ruler of the greatest empire in the West was just a child? In the final years of the Western Roman Empire, the throne of Rome no longer belonged to powerful conquerors or brilliant statesmen. Instead, it would soon be occupied by a quiet, inexperienced boy. A boy who had little understanding of the storm surrounding him. His name was Romulus Augustulus. History would remember him as the final emperor of Western Rome. But Romulus did not rise to power through great victories or popular support. His path to the throne was shaped by ambition, politics, and the influence of one powerful man, his father. That man was Orestes. Orestes was a skilled Roman general who had spent years serving within the imperial military system. As the Western Empire grew weaker, ambitious commanders like him began to hold real power behind the scenes. In the year 475 AD, Orestes decided to seize control. The sitting emperor at the time, Julius Nepos, was already struggling to maintain authority. With his army behind him, Orestes marched against the imperial government. Faced with this sudden rebellion, Julius Nepos had little choice but to flee across the Adriatic Sea to Dalmatia. Rome's throne was suddenly empty, but Orestes did not claim the crown for himself. Instead, he placed his young son on the throne. Romulus was likely no more than 15 years old when he was proclaimed emperor in 475 AD. To many people in Rome, the decision seemed strange, even symbolic. His name itself carried deep meaning. Romulus was the legendary founder of Rome. Augustulus was a smaller version of the name Augustus, the title of Rome's first emperor. It was as if the entire history of Rome had been compressed into the name of one fragile boy. Yet everyone understood the truth. The young emperor held the crown, but the real power remained with his father. Orestes controlled the army, the government, and the decisions that shaped the empire's final days. Romulus was emperor in name, but the empire around him was already collapsing. And beyond the walls of Italy, powerful forces were beginning to move, forces that would soon bring the long story of Rome to its final and irreversible end. Chapter 4: The Power Behind the Throne. Behind every weak emperor, there is often a stronger man pulling the strings. In the final days of the Western Roman Empire, that man was not the young emperor sitting on the throne. The real power belonged to his father, Orestes. While the teenage Romulus Augustulus wore the imperial crown, Orestes controlled the machinery of the state. He commanded the armies, directed the government, and made the decisions that shaped the empire's fate. To many Romans, the truth was obvious. The boy emperor was merely a symbol. Orestes had effectively become the ruler of Italy. But ruling a collapsing empire was no easy task. The Western Roman government had grown dangerously dependent on foreign soldiers. For decades, Germanic warriors had served inside Roman armies as mercenaries. They fought Rome's battles, defended its borders, and helped maintain order in a weakening empire. Now, those soldiers wanted something in return. Large numbers of these warriors were demanding land in Italy, territory where they could settle with their families. For them, it was a fair reward for years of military service. But Orestes refused. Granting them land would mean giving away part of Italy itself, the heartland of Roman power. To Orestes, that was a price too high to pay. The decision proved disastrous. The mercenary soldiers who once defended Rome began to turn against it. Their anger quickly transformed into rebellion. Among them rose a powerful and determined leader, Odoacer. Odoacer was not an ordinary warrior. He was respected by the Germanic troops serving within the Roman army. Strong, charismatic, and ambitious, he quickly became the figure around whom the rebels rallied. In 476 AD, Odoacer and his forces marched into Italy. Their target was clear. Not the young emperor sitting quietly on the throne, but the man truly responsible for the empire's decisions, Orestes. The power behind Rome's final emperor was about to face the consequences of his choices, and the fate of the Western Roman Empire was now hanging by a thread. Chapter 5: The Barbarian Revolt. Every empire has its breaking point, and Rome's had finally arrived. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire was no longer an unshakable fortress of power. Inside its borders, unrest simmered, fueled by unpaid soldiers, ambitious generals, and centuries of political decay. Outside, foreign forces waited patiently, watching the empire crumble from within. The spark ignited in the Roman army itself. For decades, Rome had relied on Germanic mercenaries to defend its frontiers. These soldiers, once loyal, now felt entitled to reward, land, titles, and security for their families. But Orestes, the true power behind the throne, refused. He would not give away Italy, the empire's heart, to satisfy foreign demands. Anger turned to rebellion. At the forefront of this uprising was a single figure, Odoacer. Charismatic, determined, and strategically brilliant, Odoacer united the discontented mercenaries under his command. What began as a mutiny soon became a march for power, a full-scale assault on Rome's fragile authority. The rebels advanced swiftly through northern Italy. Cities that had long relied on Rome's protection either surrendered or were bypassed without resistance. Many of Orestes' own troops were sympathetic to Odoacer's cause. The empire, once feared across continents, was crumbling from the inside. Orestes attempted to resist, gathering loyal forces to defend the capital. But the numbers were against him. Odoacer's army, fueled by years of neglect and resentment, overwhelmed Roman defenses. In Pavia, Orestes was captured and executed, a clear warning that the era of Roman dominance was ending. Meanwhile, the young emperor Romulus Augustulus watched helplessly from the throne. Though he bore the crown, he held no real authority. His father's fall meant the empire's final protector was gone. Odoacer now stood as the master of Italy. The revolt that had begun as a demand for land had become the instrument of history, toppling the last semblance of Western Roman power. In the shadow of rebellion, the stage was set for one final, silent act. The empire that had ruled the world for centuries would end, not with fire and blood across Rome's streets, but quietly, with a young boy surrendering his crown. The Western Roman Empire was on the brink of its final chapter. Chapter 6: The Day Rome lost its emperor. History remembers empires by their conquests, but sometimes it is silence that marks their end. In 476 AD, a quiet yet world-changing moment unfolded in Italy. The Western Roman Empire, once a titan that stretched from Britain to Egypt, faced its final, irreversible collapse. At the center of this historic turning point sat a boy of no more than 15, Romulus Augustulus. For years, Romulus had been a figurehead, the visible face of an empire that no longer functioned. The real power had always rested with his father, Orestes, whose refusal to placate the Germanic mercenaries had sparked a revolt. With Orestes gone, the throne was exposed, vulnerable to the ambitions of one man, Odoacer. Odoacer marched into Ravenna, the imperial capital, not as a conqueror seeking destruction, but as a ruler demanding submission. His approach was swift, calculated, and in many ways merciful. The young emperor was summoned before him, a boy emperor facing a seasoned warrior and the tide of history itself. The moment of surrender was quiet, almost surreal. Romulus Augustulus handed over the imperial insignia, the symbols of power, authority, and centuries of Roman legacy. In that single act, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist, not through violent conquest or grand ceremony, but through the calm resignation of a child who carried the weight of an empire he could never truly command. Odoacer spared Romulus's life. The boy was sent into obscurity in Campania, living quietly as the world moved on without him. Rome itself, stripped of its emperor, became a city under new authority, no longer the beating heart of an empire, but the center of a transformed political reality. This day did not bring fire to the streets or collapse to the walls, but it resonated through history. The empire that had shaped law, governance, and civilization across Europe and beyond was gone. Its institutions would linger, its culture would echo, but its political reign had ended forever. The fall of Rome was not sudden. It had been decades in the making. Yet the sight of a boy relinquishing the crown crystallized the empire's quiet, irreversible decline. And with that surrender, 1,000 years of Western Roman authority came to an unassuming, yet historically monumental, close. The Western Roman Empire was no more. Chapter 7: The Quiet End of an Empire. No empire ends with a single roar. Some fade, softly, almost unnoticed, until one day the world realizes they are gone. After the surrender of Romulus Augustulus in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire did not explode in chaos. There were no massive battles in Rome's streets, no fiery sieges of its great monuments. Instead, the empire dissolved quietly, leaving behind echoes of a civilization that had dominated the known world for centuries. Italy came under the rule of Odoacer, a mercenary commander turned king. He did not claim the title of emperor. Instead, he recognized the nominal authority of the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, while ruling Italy as his own. Rome, the eternal city, had lost its throne. Its emperors were no longer rulers. The Western Empire's centuries-long political presence had vanished. The machinery of government, the Senate, the imperial bureaucracy, the armies, continued in fragments, but without cohesion. Provinces that had once been tightly governed slipped into the hands of local rulers, barbarian kings, and new kingdoms. Gaul, Spain, North Africa, Britain, all were gone from the empire's control. Yet Rome's influence endured in other ways. Its laws, its language, its engineering, and its culture continued to shape the world. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, carried the Roman name and traditions for another 1,000 years. Roman roads, aqueducts, and monuments remained as reminders of a civilization that had once commanded the earth. The quiet end of the Western Empire was a paradox. Politically, it was gone. Militarily, it could not defend itself. Yet culturally, its legacy survived and would inspire future generations across Europe. Medieval kings, Renaissance scholars, and modern statesmen all traced the shadow of Rome in their laws, architecture, and ideals. For the young Romulus Augustulus, life continued quietly, far from the throne that had symbolized a dying empire. And for the people of Italy, Rome was no longer the center of a world-spanning authority. Yet, the memory of empire lingered, in stories, in ruins, and in the imagination of mankind. The Western Roman Empire ended without fanfare, but its story remains one of the most extraordinary in human history. A boy emperor, a mercenary king, and centuries of achievement, all converging in a moment that was quiet, yet monumental. Rome had fallen, but its shadow would never fade. Step into history's greatest stories. Subscribe to Midnight Empire now.